when Numbers 31 has Moses instruct the slaughter of the Midianites, saying, kill all the men, and this time the women get killed too, but not the women who haven't slept with a man. Now, why might that be? And it says,
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Genuinely so glad you are here today, because this one is a conversation I have been sitting on for a while, and I think it is going to hit different for a lot of you. What you are about to watch is a debate between a Jewish speaker defending religious scripture and an atheist challenger who is not holding back at all. The topic lands right in the middle of one of the oldest arguments in human history. Does religious scripture hold up as a moral guide, or does it collapse under its own weight when you actually read it closely? And I promise you, the direction this goes is not what either side expects going in. You do yourself a favor and stay all the way through this one, because the moment that made me rewind and watch twice does not come where you think it will. And if you leave early, you are going to miss the exchange that the entire conversation builds toward. Also, I always love knowing where in the world people are tuning in from. Drop your city or your country down in the comments. It genuinely makes this community feel alive, and I read more of those than you probably think. All right, no more setup from me. Let's get into it.
Britain.
Fine. The second point was to say, you mentioned not wanting to just to take Scripture at face value, and I understand that the difficulty of taking Scripture essentially out of context and trying to take a literal approach where a literal approach isn't supposed to be taken. I mean, people forget that the Bible is a collection of books rather than a book with lots of different
with an oral tradition and all the rest.
I saw a video once of somebody trying to use the Bible to disprove the divinity of Jesus by quoting the book of Job, saying, God is not a man that I might question him. God is not a man, you see. And I thought, not only is this in the mouth of Job, but also, that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid. But it does seem to me that there are some things within religious scripture that do need to be taken seriously and do need to be taken essentially at face value. That is, some of the very specific legalistic commandments of the Old Testament, for example, or of the Hebrew Bible, I should say. These are not, when people list these and say that these are potentially morally problematic and may have done something towards hindering, for example, like I mentioned earlier, the abolition of slavery in the United States. Of course, there was a great deal of religious influence on both sides, which is something that I've already mentioned. But don't you think that this problem could have been solved a lot more easily if there had been a stronger religious tradition of opposition to the ownership of other human beings? Why can't that have been the case?
Okay,
because Scripture quite explicitly condones it.
Right,
and in fact gives you the details of how to do
yes,
it.
So
that's something that couldn't have been done, in other words, because
you've
taken
now I guess you tell me to gloss. So
this moral principle that's placed outside of meaningful debate.
Before we move on, can I ask, where are we getting these buttons from? Are they from Amazon? You press one and everyone's an atheist.
There's this wonderful thing
these available on the market
that I think you both need to use in this conversation, which is imagination.
Oh, right.
So let's as far as why didn't the Bible prescribe the perfect world as I would see it, or as you might see it? And the answer is because two reasons. One, as stated right up top, I'm not God. I assume he has different logic than I do. Mm-hmm. Two, the Bible is in an inherently problematic position in the sense that, on the one hand, it's trying to divulge important truths for all time. At the same time, it's talking to a people of a particular time.
Yes.
And this is a well-worn tradition inside Judaism. So to take the slavery example, there is no mandate to hold slaves in the Bible. Right? There are lots of mandates in the Bible, many, many mandates. There are 613 of them according to my religion, right? That's why I do all these weird things that I do. But one of those mandates is not to hold slaves. Right? And so the idea of there was a society that existed at the time of the Bible in which slaveholding was not only ubiquitous, it was universal, and which was true for virtually all of human history.
That's right.
And could be justified not just in terms of religious scripture, but in terms of Aristotelian thought. Right? I mean, the great philosophers we like to cite sometimes in the secular tradition are big fans of slavery, and that's true virtually up until the 18th century.
Yes.
So the idea would be, is this verse attempting to woo people away from a tradition of slavery or to humanize the slaves? Or is it attempting to reinforce that by making it harsher and more difficult? And that's why actually one of the things I enjoy doing in terms of how I study the Bible, for example, is I like to look at contemporaneous religious texts of the time. So yes. I like to study the Bible alongside, for example, Hammurabi's Code. And it's really interesting to notice the differences and where the Bible is liberalizing Hammurabi's Code, for example.
This is the part of the conversation that people skip over because it sounds academic at first, but this is where the entire foundation of the religious defense gets quietly exposed before the speaker even realizes it. The argument being made here is that the Bible shouldn't be taken literally, that it's a collection of books written across different traditions for different audiences at different times. And honestly, That's a fair starting point. I actually don't have a problem with that framing on its own, but here's what blows my mind. The moment you accept that argument, you've already handed the other side something enormous. Because if Scripture is so deeply tied to the culture and the time it was written in, then you have to ask yourself, why are we still treating it as a moral compass today? You can't have it both ways. You can't say the Bible is timeless truth and say it was just speaking to people of a specific era whenever a verse becomes uncomfortable. And this is where the slavery point hits differently. The question raised is genuinely devastating. If there was supposedly a divine influence guiding this tradition, why wasn't there a stronger push against owning human beings? The answer given is essentially, well, everyone was doing it back then. Even the great philosophers endorsed it. And that's true, by the way. That's historically accurate. Aristotle built an entire justification for it. It was considered a natural part of society. But here's what people don't realize. That argument actually weakens the religious defense, not strengthens it. Because if your divine scripture sounds exactly like every other human institution of its time, then what exactly is divine about it? You're describing a document that reflects its era. That's called history. That's not revelation. The speaker even brings up Hammurabi's code as a comparison point, saying the Bible was actually more liberal than what existed before it. And look, that's an interesting historical point. Hammurabi's code, written around 1750 BC, was one of the earliest written legal systems in human civilization. And yes, comparing the two does show some differences, but the bar being set here is essentially, we were better than the worst thing that existed before us. That is not the standard you want to set when you're arguing for a divinely inspired moral framework.
Absolutely.
And so the idea that a divine revelation has to be given to human beings who are capable of following that in the time. Again, that's part of the difficulty of I think rebutting religion in a certain sense, because again, it seems wiggly, but it really isn't, in the sense that if you believe, as I do, in a God who spoke to human beings in some form or fashion, and has to speak to them on a level that they can understand, in ways they can understand, then that immediately is going to discount the ability to do a lot of very radical things that would have appeared radical in 1200 BC, but now appear to be commonplace for us.
Yes, I understand this argument, and I've heard it many times. I must say that it seems strange to me that God does seem willing to completely and utterly condemn a bunch of other practices, including, by the way, imaginary crimes like witchcraft, just done away with entirely. And even if it is the case that God, for some reason, couldn't even hint at the idea that maybe eventually we should be moving towards the abolition of the idea of owning human beings as private property, he just has to condone it.
But yes.
I still think it's the case that he would not permit a flat immorality, and I think you would agree with that too. And so when I open the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and when I look at the texts saying that if you lay siege to a city, you can kill, if the Lord delivers it into your hand, you can kill the men and the women, you can kill the men and keep the women and the children and the livestock as plunder, as Deuteronomy says. And in the very next the very next chapter says that, if you see a good-looking woman, and I'm not interjecting that. If somebody finds an attractive woman,
yes, Ifatoar is the actual Hebrew. Yeah.
Then they can take them for themselves, and if they want them as their wives, and they take them home, they shave their head, they cut off their fingernails, they give them 30 days to mourn their old husband, who you may very well have just killed, and then you can take them as your wife.
This is the moment where the religious argument starts showing real cracks, and I want you to pay close attention here, because what happens in this section is actually a really precise logical trap, and the speaker on the skeptic side springs it perfectly. The defense being offered is that God had to communicate on the level of the people he was speaking to, that radical moral changes would have been impossible to implement in 1200 BC because the culture simply wasn't ready. It sounds reasonable on the surface. Gradual change, meeting people where they are. We understand that concept. And then comes the line that honestly stopped me cold. The skeptic points out that God apparently had no problem condemning witchcraft. Completely. Entirely. Done. No gradual process. No cultural sensitivity. Just, this is wrong, and if you do it, the consequences are severe. Witchcraft, which, let's be honest, is not even a real thing. There is no documented harm caused by someone casting a spell, and yet that gets a full, unambiguous condemnation. But the ownership of actual human beings, that apparently required a slow, careful, gradualistic approach. You have to understand how intellectually inconsistent that is. The argument is essentially God could be absolute when it came to imaginary offenses, but had to tiptoe around one of the most concrete forms of human suffering ever documented. And I want to add something here that I think genuinely matters. When you look at how abolition actually happened historically, the people who fought hardest against it often used scripture to justify keeping the system in place. They weren't misreading the text, they were reading it directly. That's the inconvenient part of this conversation that the religious defense never fully answers. The skeptic then says something that I think is the sharpest point in the entire exchange, that even if God couldn't abolish the practice entirely, he still would not permit a flat immorality, and that sets up what comes next in a way that is genuinely hard to walk back from.
When Numbers 31 has Moses instruct the slaughter of the Midianites, saying, kill all the men, and this time the women get killed too, but not the women who haven't slept with a man. And why might that be? And it says that, keep them for yourselves. And I hear all the time that this is some kind of liberalizing process. Maybe it's because, these people wouldn't survive on their own. It's some kind of protective measure to make sure that you're looking after them. If that's the case, then why does it only apply to the virgins? That seems a little bit suspect to me. It's sort of Scripture's littered with these kinds of
Well,
problems.
again, so to go back to the sort of oral tradition nature,
And I don't think
what I'm
God
saying-
would permit a proactive immorality, even if he can't, for some reason, abolish the practice altogether, if you see what I'm saying.
No, that last point I don't see. So when you say even if he can't abolish the practice altogether, well...
Which already
no,
I think he would be able to do.
Right, so the question is whether he can or whether he can't. If he can't abolish the practice, then the idea of wooing people away from a particular type of sin through a gradualistic process is known throughout societies across human history. I mean, the gradualistic processes are the way that most things get done across human history. And by the way, the universal practice, unfortunately, up till today in many places in the world, is in fact the extreme version of what you're talking about. Raise everything, kill everyone. Right? That sort of stuff, unfortunately, does take place, even on planet Earth, even in the year 2023. And so the idea of a culture arising from the Bible that not only abolished slavery on its own shores, but then abolished slavery literally everywhere else, which is what Great Britain did. That, again, to separate that off from a tradition that also says that every human being is made in the image of God, right, which is the verse from Genesis, or that you have to treat the stranger well, right, which is repeated more than any injunction in the Bible, right? There are these traditions that are at war with each other inside the Bible, which is why there is this hotly fought kind of argument inside biblical circles about all of this stuff, which again is one of the reasons why I said right up top that when it gets to, I can't just open the Bible and interpret the text as I would see fit.
Oh, this is it. This is the moment the entire conversation has been building toward. What gets read directly from Numbers 31 is not an interpretation. It is not someone's opinion about what the Bible means. It is a direct instruction. And the skeptic reads it plainly. Kill the men. And this time the women are killed too, but not the women who have never been with a man. Keep those for yourselves. And then comes the question that the religious side simply cannot answer cleanly. Someone tries to reframe it as a protective measure. These people wouldn't survive on their own. It's about looking after them. And the immediate response? If that's the case, then why does it only apply to the virgins? That seems a little bit suspect to me. There is no way to dress that up. See, the protective measure argument collapses the second you apply it consistently because it was never actually applied consistently in the text. The framing only holds if you agree not to ask the obvious follow-up question. And the moment you ask it, the defense falls apart in real time. What I find most striking about this whole exchange is how the religious side keeps reaching for complexity, oral traditions, historical context, liberalizing older codes, and the skeptic keeps bringing it back to the actual words on the page, not interpretation, the words. And at some point, no amount of historical framing changes what a direct instruction says. The response that follows tries to pivot to the gradualistic process argument again, that this is how change works across human history. But that argument had already been weakened 2 minutes earlier with the witchcraft point. You can't rebuild a defense using the same foundation that was just shown to have cracks. This exchange is a reminder that engaging seriously with difficult questions inside any belief system takes real courage. And the discomfort you saw in real time in this conversation? That discomfort is actually where honest thinking begins. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.